Hello guys and girls, and welcome to today's lesson. As you can see here on the screen, our topic that we're going to go over today is theme. This is something that we have talked about this year. I know it's something we've definitely talked about in reading class, and so this is going to be just a really quick overview of what theme is and also how to identify it in passages, what you need to look for. As we go through these slides today, I do need you to take notes. You are going to pay attention to anything that you see that is highlighted in the color blue, like you currently see on your screen right now. If you see something like that, then that means that you need to write those things in your notes. So, what I want you to do first before we move on is up at the top of your page, go ahead and write the word theme. That way you know what these notes are about. And then once you have that written, you can go ahead and move on. So the first question we have to answer is, what is theme? If I were to ask you to tell me the theme of a passage, what exactly does that mean? Well, our first definition here on the screen says that theme is a life lesson, meaning, moral, or message about life or human nature that is communicated by a literary work. That is an excellent definition, but I want to put this in words that are a little bit easier to understand. So this is the definition that I want you to remember. Theme is the life lesson the story teaches the reader. So in other words, when you read a passage and I ask you to identify the theme, what I'm really asking is, what lesson is this story trying to teach us? What I need you to do now is go ahead and copy this definition that you see highlighted in blue in your notes, and then when you're ready, you can move on. Something else that we need to know about themes is that a theme is not a word, it is a sentence. In other words, again, if I were to ask you to tell me the theme of a passage and you gave me a one-word answer, that would not be correct because, like I just said, a theme is not a word, it should be a complete sentence. One other thing that you need to know is that you don't necessarily have to agree with the theme of a story in order to identify it. So if I were to ask you the theme of a story and you pulled out some kind of lesson that you actually think is not true, that doesn't mean that it's not the theme. Some examples of some really popular themes that you see in a lot of stories are things like money can't buy happiness, don't judge a book by its cover, and hard work pays off. Before you move on, I do need you to write down what you see highlighted in blue up here at the top of the screen, and then you can move on. So let's look at an example passage together, and we're going to talk about what the theme of this passage is. I'm going to read it, and I'd like you to follow along with me. Jenny was so excited. She had a pack of Starbursts in her lunch, and she'd been looking forward to eating them all morning. Lunch finally came, and Jenny sat down to eat her Starburst when her friend, Yuddy, sat next to her. "Let me get the pink ones," asked Yuddy. Jenny liked the pink ones best, but she thought Yuddy was funny and Jenny wanted Yuddy to like her, so Jenny gave Yuddy all of her pink Starburst. Before Jenny was done giving Yuddy the pink ones, Carrie sat on the other side of Jenny. "Let me get the red and the orange ones, Jenny. Remember when I gave you that Snickers?" Jenny didn't remember that, though she did remember when Carrie ate a whole Snickers in front of her. But Jenny thought Carrie was cool, so she gave her the red and orange Starburst. Now that she only had the yellow ones, Jenny wasn't so excited about eating Starburst anymore. Now, I know this is a pretty silly story about a person sharing their candy, but there are actually some important things that it can teach us about how to find the theme of a story. The first thing that I want you guys to know is that themes are not explicit, which just means clearly stated. So most of the time when you read a passage, it's not going to come right out and tell you the lesson that you're supposed to learn in the story. Instead, like our second point says here, themes are an inference. That means that you have to take the information that is given to you in the story, look at the details, look at what happens to the characters, and come up with your own logical inference or logical guess about what you think the theme of the story is. This third one is really important. Themes are bigger than the story. So let's talk about what that means. You have the small world of the story. So we have specific characters and specific things that happen in that story. And then you have the big world or the real world. When you're trying to come up with the theme of a story, you have to think outside of the small world of the story and think about a lesson that could be taught in the real world, okay? So when you're trying to come up with a theme, you're trying to figure out a lesson that could apply to anybody in the real world. So let's think back to that silly little story that we just read. But before we do, please make sure that you copy what is highlighted in blue. And then we'll go back to that story that we just read about the starburst. So going back to the story about the starburst, remember we have to think about the big picture. So that means that we are not, when we're trying to come up with a lesson, going to be pulling like any specific details about that story. So the theme is not that yellow starburst tastes bad, because if that were the theme, you'd be thinking about the small world of the story. It's also not that Yuddy and Carrie are bad friends. Again, that's not a lesson that applies to everybody. That's about the small world of the story. Like I've said several times already, when you're trying to find the theme, you have to think of real world advice that would apply to anybody. So here's some possible themes to that story. You can't buy your friends. If you think back to the story, you might remember that Jenny seemed really concerned with Carrie and Yuddy and whether or not they liked her or not. And so we can infer from that that you can't buy your friends. Just because she gave them the starburst that they wanted doesn't mean that they are actually going to be her friends. That's a lesson that could apply to anybody, not just the small world of the story. You have to take care of yourself. If you remember at the end of the story, the only starbursts that were left were the yellow ones, which Jenny said she didn't even really like. So that's another lesson that we could pull out of the story that would apply to anybody. And then not everybody is your friend. So just because Carrie and Yuddy acted like they were friends with Jenny, we could tell based on the story that they really weren't. They were just using her for her starburst. So that could be another possible theme to the story. And I want to point out here that we have 3 different themes here that all apply to that story. These would all be correct answers if I were to ask you to tell me the theme of that story. Any of these would work. So I want to make sure that we understand that stories can have more than one possible theme. As long as you can explain it and justify it, it can be a correct answer. So really quickly, let's review what we've talked about so far. Number 1, theme is what we learn from a story. It's the lesson that the story is teaching us. Number 2, themes must be inferred. So like I've said, usually a story is not just going to come out and tell you what the theme is. You have to look at the details, look at the characters, and come up with your own theme. And then last but not least, themes are about the big world. Remember, when you're trying to identify a theme, you have to think about a lesson that applies to the real world. So let's do a little bit of practice here. We're going to read, I think it's 2 different passages, and we're going to see if we can figure out what the theme of the story might be. Once there was a mean little boy who lived in a small village. This mean little boy loved to mess with people. So, one day he ran up to a sheep herder and shouted, "Wolf, wolf, a wolf is attacking the town." The sheep herder grabbed his staff and ran to defend the town, but realized he had been fooled when the boy started pointing and laughing at him. "Ha ha, I made you jump," said the boy. Then the boy ran up to a farmer and shouted, "Wolf, wolf, a wolf is attacking the town." The farmer grabbed his pitchfork and ran to defend the town. But when the boy started pointing and laughing at him, he realized he had been tricked. As the boy went back to his family's farm laughing about the funny trick he played, he saw a real wolf in his father's chicken coop. As the wolf ate all of his father's chickens, the boy screamed over and over again, "Wolf, wolf, please help us." But nobody came to help him. I want you to think about this story and tell me which one of these choices is a possible theme for this story. Here are a couple of possible correct answers. Don't ask for help unless you really need it. We saw in the story that the boy said there was a wolf a couple of times when there was not actually one. So when one wolf did actually come, people weren't willing to come help him. So that's a possible theme that we could pull out of the story. And also, don't play tricks on people around you. Let's do one more example together. Angie loved to draw. She made colorful designs of people's names with bright hearts and flowers, but she lost her own markers, so she borrowed her teacher's. The school day was ending, but Angie wanted to keep coloring, so she took the teacher's markers home and lost them in her messy room. She came back to school the next day and wanted to color again, so she asked the teacher for more markers. The teacher replied, "Sure, Angie, but this is my last pack." Angie said she would be careful, but by the end of the day, the markers were scattered all over the floor, and the custodian swept them up and threw them away. When Angie came in the next day, she asked the teacher for more markers, but she was disappointed to find out that there weren't any more. "I don't know where all of my markers went," said the teacher, "but I don't have them." Angie was sad because she couldn't draw any more pictures. So take a look at this passage. Tell me, what do you think the possible theme is for this passage? A couple of correct answers here would be treat others' items with respect. If Angie had just kept up with the coloring supplies, she could have used them over and over again instead of being sad that she didn't have any at the end of the story. And you can't always get what you want. Thank you for following along with this lesson today. I appreciate you guys, and we'll see you in the next one.